Hi. So I thought it would be time to share my opinion about religion and whether or not I believe in a god of some type.
After refuting feminism so thoroughly, it begins to look like the conservative Christians were right about everything all along. And this makes atheists like Vernaculis feel insecure. Therefore, it's virtue signaling time.
I've made references in previous videos about what I believe, but I think fleshing out my reasoning here would be a worthwhile practice. I'm sure many people who watch my channel are familiar with the standard arguments that are had among the religious and non-religious.
I doubt that very much. I think that both Vernaculis himself and his audience are only familiar with the common arguments of the non-religious, not the common arguments of the religious. I think they've been living in a very one-sided echo chamber on this issue and probably couldn't name more than perhaps one or two of the major arguments for God, and those would be the ones that atheists like to talk about the most, not the ones that theists like to talk about the most. I would like to digress for a moment to ask what he means by common arguments, however. I would hope that he means arguments put forward by philosophers, not necessarily arguments put forward by average Joes. We should be judging philosophies by the arguments that are put forward by their philosophers, not by average Joes. Because if you go to the average Christian, they're going to be an idiot, just as if you go to the average atheist, they're going to be an idiot. You need to actually go and look at what the experts are saying on these subjects, not what some random person on the street can stumble into arguing.
Originally, I was confronted with this question at a very young age. My friend in elementary school was a Mormon, and I attended his church in order to spend more time with him, due to the other time constraints on his life apart from our friendship. I became very interested in religion, and so, since I was a reader anyway, I picked up these great books, such as the Bible and the Quran, in order to examine what all the fuss was about. I even studied some Eastern teachings, and unfortunately for all of them, I was spectacularly unimpressed.
I know I'm going to sound like a jerk for saying this, but what this is telling me is that you had bad parents. By bad parents, I do not mean parents that didn't love you or weren't trying their best. I mean parents that failed at one of their major jobs. Assuming that we're talking about at a very young age, we don't mean college aged, we really mean grade school aged, then it sounds to me like you had the sort of parents who said that we are not going to tell our children what to believe. And so they failed at one of the most important jobs of a parent, which is to leave a legacy or heritage for their child which orients them in the world. The Christian parent tells their child, here is Christianity. The Muslim parent tells their child, here is Islam. The Buddhist parent tells their child, here is Buddhism. The atheist parent tells their child, here is a condom. Here is atheism. But your parents apparently told you nothing. And so you were left adrift to shop for an ideology, like a lost child in the store, comparing between things they do not understand. And you were left to do this at the most ignorant time in your life. Don't get offended, it is the most ignorant time in everyone's life, early childhood, the time when we all possess the least amount of information and experience. This is not the time we should be choosing our ideology with no guidance from parents. We should be brought up in the parents' ideology. And then when we get to high school and college, this is when we go and investigate the intellectual case for our parents' ideology, and as part of becoming an adult, we decide whether we embrace it or rebel against it. We are meant to be sorting through the ideologies of the world, already having one, and then comparing the one we've got with all the new ones that we learn about in college and, to some extent, high school, and deciding about each one, is this better than what I've already got? But when you've got no guidance from your parents and you're left wandering through all of the different ideologies of the world, having been given only a vaguely cynical attitude that they're all pretty much the same, then of course you're going to be an atheist given that input at that age. That output is almost guaranteed. So don't give me this, oh, I looked into all the religions when I was a small child and I decided none of them were good enough. You don't know anything when you're a small child. My own religion has children making a decision about joining the church or not when they are 8 years old. But I think most people would agree that it is reasonable that when they get to high school and college, they're going to be taking a second look at the ideology that they're raised in, and that this is natural and part of growing up. And it is part of the exercise of their agency and so forth. So while the decision made at 8 years old is a real decision and an important decision, it is not and shouldn't be the only point of decision. But at the same time, people in high school and college shouldn't be comparing the children's version of their own ideology that they learned growing up with the adult version of everything else. They should be comparing the adult version to the adult version, which means they have to study their own ideology as well. So there is a process of studying that should be going on at college age, not at a very young age. Anyone who says children have no ideology do not remember their own childhood very accurately. And anyone who says, I will not tell my children what to believe, is a fool, because if you don't, then someone else will. The recruiters for Islam absolutely love this Western, I will not tell my children what to believe idea, by the way. It gives them a rather large opening.
What worries me about the next generation and my possible future children is what they will be listening to. What will be convincing them of certain positions they should hold. It's not like I would prevent my kids from listening to or reading a single book or watching a particular YouTube channel or news network, but I will carve into their minds the value of questioning everything. If there is one thing that can be justifiably put in the heads of children, it's the value of not simply believing whatever you hear. First off, you aren't raised by society. You are raised by your parents. You actually have two people, if you're lucky, telling you what is right and wrong and how to operate in the world. They are your guides until you gain the ability to guide yourself through the world.
Which is it, Vernaculis? Are parents supposed to be guides, or are you supposed to question everything? It can't be both. You can't guide someone into rejecting guidance. The method contradicts the message.
It may sound hypocritical to some sticklers, but it really isn't. It isn't brainwashing to teach children not to fall for brainwashing.
Whoa. Hold on a minute here. The term brainwashing is rather extreme rhetoric, don't you think? I rather think we should be reserving the term brainwashing for the techniques of the Viet Cong and things like that. I really don't think it's real brainwashing unless it involves copious amounts of sleep deprivation and torture. I think that a more fair-minded term for what you probably mean by brainwashing would be indoctrination, except that in some sense indoctrination is synonymous with education. Education is putting doctrines in. We go to school, facts come into our brains, and then we go home. That's what indoctrination means. And that's what education means. They are the same thing. And if brainwashing is to be distinguished from normal education of children, then it cannot mean indoctrination into things that are unproven, because children do not learn things by proof. Children are given answers to questions, and then they pretty much believe the answer. Children do not learn very much by syllogism. Some things, perhaps, but that is not, in the main, how children learn. I would assume you would want to avoid defining this bad indoctrination you're referring to as brainwashing in a way that would be attacking what most people would consider normal childhood education. You're trying to refer to some kind of extreme form of education, I would assume. So perhaps by brainwashing, what you really mean is a certain kind of education or indoctrination which has bad properties, like being irrational or extreme or violent or something to that effect. Which, I gotta say, sounds a lot like what the SJWs are trying to do with their whole hate speech campaign. Unfortunately, having had a number of discussions like this with various members of the online atheists community, I strongly suspect that you're going to find some way to define your terms so that an education which disagrees with you about metaphysics or epistemology or especially sexual ethics is brainwashing, while agreeing with you is education. Real education. Real education is agreeing with Vernaculis, while not agreeing with Vernaculis is brainwashing somehow. I hope you can avoid this kind of irrational prejudice, but my hopes are not very high considering the community that you come from. Anyway, that's enough about education for now. On to the God stuff.
But I'm not really going to be arguing internal inconsistencies or how gods seem to be very petulant for things that are all-knowing and all-powerful.
Oh, well, that's a relief. We were all shaking in our boots.
I'm going to be arguing against the claim that a god of some type exists. Before you get into an argument with someone who is religious, it's always advantageous for you to get them to define what they mean by God. There are many superficial atheists who scream, "Ha ha ha, bearded man sitting on a cloud in the sky," and that annoys me because that's not generally what these people actually believe. Although it's used for mockery, it's not quite an accurate representation of the general religious person.
It's nice that he's making some attempt to fairly represent the view that he is arguing against, but the attempt fails because in the rest of the video, he builds an even bigger and even dumber straw man than the one he acknowledges to be a straw man here. Believing in a bearded man in the sky is an idea with perfect internal logical consistency. There's no inherent contradiction in it. It may be stupid, but it's not illogical. I would rather be accused of being in error about facts than in making an error in logic, such as Vernaculis suggests in the rest of the video, because facts are not accessible to all, they are only accessible to those who are taught them. But logic should be accessible to all should be capable of reasoning. And so, if Christians really are guilty of believing what he accuses them of in the rest of the video, then Christians must be deficient in their reasoning. And this is actually a rather worse insult than saying that they believe in a bearded man in the sky. This really feeds into this whole narrative that somehow Christians throughout history have been totally incapable of reason, and the only people who really can actually use logic are atheists. Which is about as ridiculous as the Calvinist who says that because non-Calvinists are totally depraved and have a reprobate mind, therefore atheists can't do math.
Theists believe in God as some sort of supernatural being that interferes in the affairs of humans and has a will that should be followed. What I've seen from the most intelligent of people who believe in a God is the idea that God is supernatural. And since this God is supernatural, it cannot be scientifically tested for due to the fact that it's not, natural. This usually comes after a demand for some sort of objective evidence of this particular deity. What always frustrated me about this claim is that there doesn't seem to be any rational basis for God being beyond human testing, apart from the simple claim that God is beyond human testing.
Which only shows that you haven't actually studied the arguments. If you had, then you would have read Miracles, a Preliminary Study by C.S. Lewis, preferably the second edition from 1960, or one of the books that influenced it, or one of the books that was influenced by it, which directly addresses this question.
It just seems to be a cop-out when evidence is actually demanded. The reason I say this is because throughout history there were many things that were deemed supernatural that became naturally explained via the scientific method.
There is no the scientific method because there is no science. What there actually is would be the natural sciences, which are many, and which have many different methods. The methods of biology do not apply to astronomy. The methods of astronomy do not apply to electrical engineering. Real science is not in the business of providing a vast cosmological myth on which you can base your religion and attack other people's. Nor have the sciences ever been able to discredit any significant miraculous claim that I am aware of. When did this happen?
One of those things being how the Earth got here.
Wrong. You are here appealing to your conclusion as a premise in order to prove your conclusion. What you need to find is a common premise, something that those you are arguing with acknowledge is a miraculous claim, and which they acknowledge is false, and then you need to show how the sciences debunked it, and show how these false miracles are the same in principle as the miracles which your theistic interlocutors believe in. This is pretty basic argumentation theory stuff right here. If you are going to argue against theism, then the falsehood of creationism is not a premise held in common that you can appeal to in order to justify your atheism. It is instead a conclusion that you need to argue from common premises in order to justify.
This argument appears to be just another step in that chain, except it may be the final step, considering the religious over the years have needed to adjust claims to science as opposed to the other way around.
When Vernaculis began this video, he said that it's always to the advantage of the atheist to demand that the theist define God at the outset. I think this may be to the advantage of both parties. It's always a good idea to begin by defining your terms, and the theist has just as much right to demand that the atheist define their God of science. What is this science? What gets to count as science and what doesn't? What I think we will often find is that if a thing is disproved, then it was disproved by science, which means that all disproofs are scientific disproofs, which means that science is everything and nothing. On examination, I find that the God of the atheists is as mysterious as any other God, and the atheist religion is as mystical as any other.
If God is not scientifically testable, then how are individual religious people actually detecting God in the first place?
I should think it would be obvious that religious people have detected God through religious experience, or in other words, through revelation. Now, I do not subscribe to the argument from religious experience because I think of these religious experiences as something which would be in the conclusion which the theist would be trying to argue for, and not in the premises that would be common between theists and atheists. Treating the religious experiences of religious people as a reason for atheists to believe in God would be begging the question. However, if you're asking a different question, if you're asking why religious people believe in God, how did they come to believe in God, the answer is through religious experience. But I think what might be sort of in the atheist's mind here is, well, why can't I build some kind of God detector box which can see through the universe to find God the same way an X-ray sees through flesh to find bones, something like in the Ghostbusters movie? And sure, you might be able to do something like that. Of course, I do not think atheists would be convinced by it if it did occur. I mean, after all, as far as science proving God, I think the sciences have already spoken on that as clearly as they are probably ever going to, and that is they came up with the Big Bang Theory. Before the Big Bang Theory, atheism was pretty much anchored to steady state theory, the idea that the universe had no beginning. It was supposed that if it could be proven that the universe had a beginning, this would pretty much wrap it up for atheism as far as science is concerned. And with the Big Bang Theory, we pretty much met that goal already. So everything from the atheistic community since then has seemed to theists like a moving of the goalposts. To have a Big Bang, you pretty much need a Big Banger. Atheists in the past were like, name one, just one attribute of God that you can prove using science. And the theists were like, okay, originator of the universe. And the atheists were like, okay, now name two.
You seem to be told that you'll get proof that your belief is true once you already believe that belief is true.
Yeah, I agree that's dumb. Moving on.
There will be some people who claim I have faith in the scientific method or scientific inquiry or logic and whatnot. At least for me, it is not a matter of faith to believe that the scientific method and scientific inquiry seem to be the best methods in determining what is objectively true about the universe and what isn't.
All beliefs require faith because all arguments require premises and all premises require assumptions. As Sherlock Holmes put it, data, 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 I cannot make bricks without clay. The difference between what we might call religious faith and what we might call atheistic faith, well, there are probably two differences. One is that religious faith entails more than an epistemological belief. I'm sure the faith that moves mountains is not quite the same thing as a mere belief. And the second thing that makes them different is simply their object. Christians have faith, atheists have faith, they just have faith in different things. Some of the same things, but some different things. So the argument shouldn't be about whether to have faith or not. You do, in fact, have faith. The argument should be over when it is appropriate to exercise faith and in what objects.
The conflation that seems to be present here is faith that something unproven is true, and faith in a method of determining what is or isn't true. One is trusting a particular claim, while the other is trusting a method used to examine claims.
No, this distinction between particular claims and methods about claims is not a valid distinction. To say, is it in the Bible or not, is just as much a method as what you call the scientific method. There's nothing special about merely being a method. And by the way, anytime I say science singular, assume I am referring to the natural sciences.
However, the moment someone presents to me a different method that is better at determining what is objectively true, I'd abandon the scientific method in a heartbeat. And so would most scientists, to be perfectly frank.
Well, that wouldn't be justified. To justify that, you would have to prove not only that the new method is better, but that the new method is the only method, which you haven't proved even for this fabled single unified scientific method that your argument depends on.
What's weird about this is, by what means would you test the claim that one method is better than the other? Whether one means by which to examine reality is more accurate about reality than the other.
This is actually the best part in the video because here we have some real thinking. That is real philosophical thinking going on there. I applaud it.
Of course, science gets things wrong from time to time and then later refines them. Of course, science gets things wrong from time to time and then later refines them. Of course, science gets things wrong from time to time and then later refines them, and then later refines them, and then later refines them, and then later refines them.
When Vernaculis is like, we know that science has a track record of getting things wrong. Oh, but it always corrects it. Doesn't that sound a little desperate? Like someone whose faith is being crashed against the rocks of reason? Like someone who absolutely has to virtue signal to everyone else that, oh no, I'm still really invested in this. You know, I've just refuted myself, but oh, I still believe it. Are we really expected to not see that this applies as much to everything that is being claimed now as it does to everything that was being claimed in the past. You can't trust any of it if any of it could turn out to be wrong later. We certainly can't trust it to the degree that is being demanded by the atheistic community, that we abandon our religions and we completely change our economy in order to accommodate this climate change nonsense, or we completely change our family structures to accommodate this LGBTQWXYZ nonsense. That kind of trust is not warranted if any of it could turn out to be wrong tomorrow. Of course, I would only have to actually resort to this kind of quasi-postmodern skepticism if all of those things really were supported by genuine science and were not simply political. I don't admit that any of those things are really supported by genuine science. But if I did, I would have to raise this postmodern type of doubt about them. Because I've got more sources of information than just science. And these additional sources of information have, for the most part, kept people out of a lot of the huge historical blunders that the sciences have made. At least it's kept them out of them when they raised serious moral problems. These additional sources of information are not all religious. Some of it is simply the traditions of humanity, what we call the natural law. But these additional sources of information will lead us to make statements such as, we know that this policy is wrong. Even if it is supported by science, we're not doing it. Period. And this is a bulwark against that kind of error coming into the political arena and wreaking havoc. So for practical purposes, I don't actually have to doubt the sciences, I only have to doubt the politics. Because let's not kid ourselves, the debate between atheism and theism is not a merely abstract philosophical debate with no practical upshot. It is ultimately a political debate. It is a debate about how we should live our lives and how we should govern, and what kind of society we should be. And you're going to need something better than, but it always corrects it, to justify atheists taking over our government and forcing our kids into your atheist schools to learn atheism in the name of science, which is what you're really arguing for.
But compare that to religious claims about reality that were summarily disproven. It's no contest.
A favorite tactic of the typical internet atheist is to construct a rivalry between religion and science. Religious people usually don't do this, but sometimes they can be goaded into going on a sort of anti-scientific tirade, like I just went on, except that usually what they're really criticizing is the encroachment of left-wing ideology into politics under the guise of science. It's usually not science itself that they have a problem with. No one is advocating an abandonment of the natural sciences in order to only study theology instead. That's not even a thing.
I'm not trying to conflate theists with creationists, by the way, but you get the idea.
Why are you not trying to conflate theists with creationists? It seems to me that creationism is a necessary corollary to theism. Perhaps you meant young Earth creationists, in which case this is a valid point you're making here, that theists are not the same thing as young Earth creationists. Young Earth creationists are a group of theists, and theism is much broader than young Earth creationism. But all Christians are creationists in some sense, in the sense that all believe that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Whether the story laid out in Genesis is a literal recording of exactly what happened on what day, or whether it is something else, is more of an open question for theists. But I think all, or nearly all, would acknowledge that the statement that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is true. And that, by itself, is the definition of creationism. There are no additional qualifications necessary to be a creationist. It would be very difficult to accept theism without accepting creationism in this broad sense.
And since I think the scientific method is the best way to come to the objective truth in regards to the universe and how it operates, when someone mocks the scientific method or says that they know something is true when it cannot be scientifically tested, I start to fall into disbelief.
Atheists get just as offended when you mock their God and blaspheme their God as any other religious people. There's nothing special about atheism in this regard.
What makes my brow furrow is how this particular person even came to have this belief themselves. I would have a difficult time believing anyone could come to this belief on a rational basis. From what I've seen, the contemporary arguments for a god stem from areas in which science has not explained a certain phenomenon or cannot, with current technology, explain or test it.
Why are you focusing on the contemporary arguments? This is a perennial question in philosophy. The entire history of philosophy has relevant arguments on it. If you're going to really seriously take on theism, then you have to address Aquinas. Where are the 5 ways? Where's Pascal's wager? Where's Lewis's trilemma and the argument from joy? Where's Anselm's ontological argument? Do you even college, bro?
This can be simply dismissed as begging the question. The religious person will be assuming that God is the cause of everything we cannot explain just yet. Lack of an explanation does not, by default, mean that your explanation is the correct one.
Indeed, and at the same time, just because something happened doesn't mean it happened by purely natural causes. We're here, therefore we must have got here through purely natural causes is not a valid argument, but atheists make it all the time.
And simply saying, how do you explain this coincidence or that phenomenon, if not for the existence of a god, does not an argument make. Even if science got everything it's ever discovered about the universe completely wrong, that does not prove that a god is behind it all.
You see the giant straw man he's constructed here. Science has to be wrong in order for there to be a god. Nobody really argues that.
For example, if I throw a ball into the air 99 times, and every single time I throw it, it returns to the ground, it is quite reasonable in my mind to assume that it will fall to the earth again on the 100th throw. You have evidence prior to the assumption to work with in that case.
And now the moment you've all been waiting for. Ladies and gentlemen, it's David Hume time! Except that I don't think Vernaculis has ever read Hume or even has the intellectual backing to really discuss this subject constructively, so it's gonna be tough to try and cover this when the video's already gone on this long.
Also, I hold to the assumption that the laws of physics work the same way everywhere in the universe, because so far, from what we've observed, they seem to, apart from the quantum level.
But essentially, what David Hume points out is that all inductive reasoning on which science is based, which is the type of reasoning Vernaculis is discussing here, is essentially fallacious. We really don't know that the small local phenomena that we have observed here on Earth under laboratory conditions necessarily applies exactly the same way to the entire vast, apparently infinite universe, and not only in the present, but indefinitely into the future and indefinitely into the past, and that no matter how far you go away from the Earth, or into the future, or into the past, we can be absolutely certain as we are about anything, that all of the small local observations we've made will hold true as a rule in all of those circumstances. This is a vast amount of faith that I simply do not share. I think things will get less certain the further into the future we go, and the further into the past we go, and the further away from the actual observations we've made go. And I see no reason why we should be compelled to accept all of these far-flung conclusions about the distant future and the distant past beyond recorded history that so much of our scientific popularizers' literature tries to implant in the popular imagination. Why should we believe any of that? We know that the apparent patterns we have described as the laws of physics generally hold true on this Earth and in this solar system for now. That's all we really know. The rest of it is speculation.
Mainly due to the idea, at least in my head, that even though we can no longer observe part of the observable universe is, of course, based simply on our position in the universe. So we pass into various unobservable universes when compared to other things on the edge of our observable universe.
What the heck was that? I'm going to assume that was a botched attempt at making an interpretation of quantum physics, which can make even the physicists themselves blither and go cross-eyed. One thing I might say about quantum physics is that some interpretations of quantum physics try to have quantum physics somehow overturning Aristotle's fundamental laws of thought. And as a philosopher, I can basically say, no, you're not allowed to do that. If you've got a mess in your discipline, then you need to clean it up. You don't get to change the rules of logic just because you've got a mess you can't explain in your discipline. Clean up your own messes. Logic is a standard for evaluating science, not the other way around. But this is only in interpretations of quantum physics. The actual physics is simply a bunch of math. As soon as you put it into words, you're making an interpretation of it, which is not the same thing as the actual physics. So you're pretty much, as a philosopher, free to disagree with any interpretation of quantum physics anyone tries to make. And because of this, I don't think that quantum physics is particularly relevant to philosophy.
If you make the logical jump from, you can't scientifically test for this invisible, all-knowing, all-powerful deity, but I actively believe it exists, then you have proven yourself to hold a distinctly irrational belief. Do not pretend it is based in science, do not pretend it is based in logic, don't even pretend it is based in philosophy. It is based on mere faith.
Well, as a piece of friendly advice, you might be able to get us to stop doing that if you actually addressed any of the arguments put forward by prominent theistic philosophers in history, which you haven't done at all. Of course, believing in God is based on faith because it is a belief, and all beliefs are based on faith ultimately. The question is whether it is a sort or type or degree or direction of faith that is reasonable or not. And you have not shown that it is unreasonable because you have not even addressed the main arguments. Vernaculis, you need to go online and take a course in philosophy of religion. There are lots of good audiobook courses available. And then come back and try and address these issues, because you totally haven't studied them.